couldn't find my mute button for some reason, but hello everybody. My name is Charlene Van Buchenhout. I'm the Programming and Marketing Director for Dalnavert Museum. We welcome you all here. Thank you so much for joining us today on this. I don't know if everyone is in Winnipeg on Treaty 1, but it's a little bit cloudy and a little bit rainy, so it's a nice day for a lecture. So welcome, Tanchikia Wow, everyone. Today, we gather virtually together from many different places. And it is a gift for us to be together in this way and to gather virtually on this land that we call Winnipeg, which is located on Treaty 1 territory. Treaty 1 was signed only 24 years before Dalnavert Museum, or Dalnavert was built as a house in 1895. This area of Turtle Island is the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dene, and Dakota peoples, and is the homeland of a nation that I am a proud member of, the Métis Nation. This is the second installment of the Elizabeth Alloway Lecture Series. Dalnavert Museum is honored to host this series in collaboration with the Winnipeg Foundation's Centennial Institute. And in celebration of the Elizabeth Alloway History Scholarship Fund, which you can donate to on the Winnipeg Foundation's website. And I encourage you all to do this because this fund is $7,500 annual award going to support a second-year master's student in researching how women have shaped the history of Canada and understanding the roles of women in Canadian history. So it's a really exciting fund named for Elizabeth Alloway, and actually it's a joint fund with Dalnavert Museum. So supporting the scholarship fund will also benefit the museum, which is a nonprofit, and right now all the dollars are good dollars, always. But this fund is named for Elizabeth Alloway, who, if you don't know anything about her, I will tell you. Along with her husband, William Alloway, they were instrumental in starting and establishing the Winnipeg Foundation in 1921. When Elizabeth died in 1926, she left her entire estate to the foundation, which was over $800,000. Amazing inspirational legacy. She was deeply interested and committed to charitable work, especially when it came to the welfare of children and women, and she was interested in the career of nursing. She was an excellent host and lived just down the street from her friends, McDonald and Dalnavert, at a house that they called the Dairies on Assiniboine. So we have Dalnavert and the Dairies. On Saturdays, Elizabeth was known to host parties at the Dairies, and it was said that no one was turned away. So I took this this idea and went forward with it with the lecture series, and we have a really large range of topics. And for the second lecture today, we have Out at Dalnavert and then Sexuality in the Victorian Era with Dr. Kyle McPhail, who has a PhD in Museum Studies from the University of Leicester, where their research focused on queer art histories and representation of gender, sexuality, and identity in mainstream art museums. They have a special interest in transgender representation and narrative. So without further ado, I will welcome Dr. Kyle McPhail.
Thanks, Charlene. Okay, so hello everyone, I'm Kyle McPhail. My pronouns are they, them, just, FYI. And today I'm going to talk to you about gay things. So my lecture is entitled Out at Dalnavert, Art, Sexuality, and Gender Through the 19th and 20th Century Art. So we're going to talk a lot about queer narratives and just gay things today. Just to start off, queerness hasn't always been visible. But if we don't acknowledge these queer histories, our understandings of the subject will always be incomplete and fragmented. Queer communities have existed throughout histories, and they became more increasingly visible in the Victorian era. This was in part due to figures like Oscar Wilde. However, outside of Oscar Wilde, the subculture was gaining in popularity and visibility in the 19th and 20th centuries. So despite this, often these narratives aren't in museums or galleries or heritage spaces, whether this is conscious or unconscious. Often the narrative that is produced is heteronormative, and it underplays, ignores, or erases queer presence, or it takes the queer presence out of things. Um, and this is just kind of like a phenomenon across the world in museums and galleries and heritage spaces. So people were either forced to hide or their narratives were erased. So if they didn't want to, be closeted, often they were closeted by someone else. So just a little, here's my plan. So I'm briefly going to talk about queer Winnipeg and Canada in the 19th century, just to give a little context. And then we're going to go into the house. And I'm going to go through some of the objects in the house and highlight queer moments as they relate to art and objects in Dalnavert. As much as I would have liked to talk about a wider range of subjects, I would have loved to have talked about queer history or trans histories, wider queer histories. We don't have a whole day, so I decided to set the parameters on objects I could find in the house and how I could relate those to art movements that have kind of a queer, narrative or a queer history to it. Maybe part 2 of this lecture will be me talking about trans narratives, because I love that, but not today. But also I feel like it's important to center this on Dalnavert because it gives us an opportunity to look at the museum and kind of reflect on what is there and the queer histories that are there. I mean, we have been looking at, the policing and censorship of queerness in nearby institutions that are just down the street from Dalnavert. But in a way, you have to ask, how are we better? How are we talking about these stories? How are we sharing these stories? Are we sharing these stories? Are we talking about these stories? So I feel like this is a really nice opportunity to center kind of these queer narratives on Dalnavert and then talk about how these people existed, and just really begin a conversation. So the goal of this lecture is to start a conversation about queer histories in and their places in museums. So we're going to talk a little bit about background. So fun fact, Dalnavert is in the heart of what would have been the secret, or not so secret, queer scene in Winnipeg. Queer spaces in Winnipeg were mostly centered in the downtown core, so rail yards, beer parlors, even the legislature was kind of this secret, not so secret queer meetup space in early Winnipeg histories. So just a little bit of context to kind of what was happening in the 19th century in terms of kind of queer living. In 1841, the Canadian Criminal Code stated that the death penalty would be issued to all persons engaging in same-sex relationships. Obviously, Canada was a colony of the United Kingdom, so a lot of British laws kind of, influenced a little bit. This legislation was part of what was called the Buggery Law. Buggery, which also is known as sodomy, once applied to only AMAB or assigned male at birth people. In 1861, this was lessened to a maximum punishment of life in prison. Then in 1892, laws were changed to include quote unquote gross indecency. Some of you might know that this was something that Oscar Wilde was convicted of. In Canada, these laws persisted into the 20th century. It kind of in between 1948 and 1961, often these laws targeted what they thought were criminal sex psychopaths or dangerous sex offenders. And these were the titles that were given them not only by law, but by psychiatrists in prisons. So this really highlights that at this time in Canada, this wasn't just a moral issue to these lawmakers, it was also what they saw as an issue of mental health. So obviously around this time in the 19th century, Winnipeg was growing very fast, and this was mostly due to the railway. So Winnipeg was a city of commerce because of the railway, and the economic boom that occurred in the 1880s and 1890s led to how large homes like Dalnavert being built. But the railway also was really important to queer histories in Winnipeg because it was where gay men went to cruise. And cruising was the process of actively looking for sex partners in public spaces. So cruising often was like parks or docks, and it developed out of this necessity to be discreet and secretive. So homosexuality obviously was illegal at this time. So you risked being arrested or you risked kind of facing violence for cruising. So the secretive element was extremely key. There was like a lot of cruising spots around Winnipeg, the YMCA, the Grenadiers Club. There were some docks near Alexander Street, parks, bathhouses, and the hill behind the legislature. So just like a little bit away from Dalnavert. Winnipeg's iconic Golden Boy would have been above these gay men while they were cruising. Also, the place behind the ledge, which is called the Hill, was where great gay prostitutes would hang out. So there's a whole like queer history to that space itself, which is very interesting. And like cruising was very important, not only for like finding like sex partners, but also in meeting other queer people. In this time, you had to hide yourself. So it was really important to form a community. Otherwise, you'd be extremely isolated. And I'm sure a lot of us know that feeling with COVID of isolation. Additionally, World War I and World War II had a very interesting impact on the queer communities in Winnipeg. Suddenly people were, traveling around. They were going to large cities like London and Toronto, and they were being exposed to these larger communities that had thriving queer scenes. So people kind of started to live these double lives where they would be queer in secret and then go to these queer clubs and these queer spaces, and they could be out. And this is something that persisted into the 20th century and into now. I mean, there's still people who live this life. It was very common in the 80s. But yeah, so this is kind of, some of the starts of this. In 1957, the Wolfenden Report was released in the UK, and this report advocated for the decriminalization of homosexuality. However, it wasn't until 1967 that the recommendations were acted upon in the UK, which saw the partial decriminalization of gay sex. In Canada, it wasn't until 1969 that a bill was passed that decriminalized gay sex. I mean, in the 1960s, there was a lot of 2S LGBTQIA people fighting for their rights. In 2005, it was same-sex marriage was made legal. People continue to fight for our rights today. I mean, obviously, discrimination still exists. These kind of laws don't like change everything. And it's interesting to think that it wasn't that long ago that Canadians were being forced to hide. There was a threat of violence, a threat of death just for being gay. So that is kind of a little bit of the context of, like a little bit of queer histories and what was happening at the time. So now we're going to go into the house. And just going into the house, we're going to start with the art movement that is called Neoclassicism. It was during the 18th century and then lasting into the 19th century that you saw this revival of classical design. And when I say classical, I mean ancient Roman and ancient Greek art and architecture. It was very popular in art and decor, and it was brought upon by archaeological discoveries of Pompeii. So they were suddenly unearthing this, massive, really well-preserved site, and people just couldn't get enough of these sculptures. So they started to make their own versions of them in the 18th and 19th centuries. Many of the elements of it reflect neoclassical art. There's often like this kind of idealized athletic male nude, and that suddenly became really popular again. So this kind of also relates a little bit to the Golden Boy, because it kind of is this, like athletic male nude that was very much inspired by antiquity. I mean, it's an image of Mercury, or if you're Greek, Hermes, and there's a whole like queer mythology that goes along with Hermes as well. He was one of the many Greek gods who also was a queer person in the mythology. So there's like a whole thing tied to that, which also kind of adds to him being a little bit of a like gay icon within the city. So this wasn't the first time that like Greek and Roman classical art kind of had like a revival. Sorry, a revival. It was in the Renaissance that you saw this as well. You had a lot of artists do images of kind of Greek gods. There's famous ones like Michelangelo and Cellini did these. There's a lot of homoeroticism in these images. As I said, this athletic male nude. You have like Apollo and Hyacinth, Ganymede and Jupiter, Achilles and Patroclus. All of these stories were gay stories from antiquity, and they're all being revived in this kind of rigid neoclassical Victorian style. However, there often these stories either were thought of as being okay because there's this distance. So you have like, oh, it's okay to depict a little bit of homoeroticism because this was in the past. So this distance creates this kind of divide, I guess. So it doesn't seem as dangerous, or it was just completely censored, which is kind of what you have in the story of Jupiter and Ganymede, which is what I'm going to focus on now. So in these images, you see this eagle. And like when I first walked into Dalnavert and I saw these are at the bottom of the main staircase in the house. And I went, that image looks really familiar to me. And I think that it's very inspired by some of these classical and Renaissance images of Ganymede and Jupiter. So for those of you who don't know the story, Ganymede was a shepherd and Jupiter saw him and was like, oh my God, yes. So he just instantly fell in love. So he turned himself into an eagle and kidnapped Ganymede and made him his lover. The Victorian version of the story was censored. He kidnapped Ganymede and made him his cupbearer, which also is in the original, but he was his lover and cupbearer. And just in the Victorian version, he didn't want to be his lover. Ganymede was not interested in that. But I mean, you look at this image of the eagle in the staircase, and it's clearly kind of inspired by some of these. And you look at these three images. The one in the middle actually is from antiquity. It's from 2nd century CE, and the other two are Renaissance images. And yeah, you just see like the kind of loving look, but especially the drawing on the end, which is from Michelangelo. And there's just kind of just really like tender, loving look between the two of them. This drawing was made for Michelangelo's lover, whose name was Caravari. And they would have known exactly what the meaning of a drawing of Ganymede. And at the time, Ganymede actually was a term used for like gay men. At one point, someone tried to, someone called Cellini a Ganymede, and he was like, yeah, whatever. So like this was kind of a term that they would have known. And so this imagery wouldn't have been lost on anybody who kind of knew what it was. And so you have this imagery, which to me is extremely homoerotic, kind of pop up a little bit in the house here with this eagle. And for me, it's the first thing I think of is Ganymede, and it's kind of has this like queer, maybe this queer inspiration. So I find that very interesting. So moving on from Neoclassicism into Pre-Raphaelites and Aestheticism. So just a little background on Pre-Raphaelites. It was a group of people who decided to rebel against the Royal Academy of London. So they formed this Pre-Raphaelite brotherhood, and they looked to the past for inspiration. And their thought process was that everything since Raphael was poor art. So they took inspiration from artists before Raphael. They particularly favored Botticelli. And Botticelli, also another queer person from history. Botticelli liked to do images of redheads, and you see a lot of pre-Raphaelite images with redheaded models. They also took inspiration from Gothic art, and it was kind of more about the aesthetics than anything. It didn't last as long as they wanted it to, but then it went into the aestheticism movement, which was a little bit more longer lasting. So it was influential, even though didn't last that long. And this little print is this is a print by Edward Burne-Jones, and it's in the parlor at Dalnavert. But before we go into aestheticism and kind of unpack the queerness of it, we're going to have a little camp interlude. So here's some examples of camp here for you, if you want to take a look at. So, what is camp? Camp is the love of unnatural, exaggerated, and artifice. It is an aesthetic sensibility, just all about exaggeration. If you ever read Susan Sontag's notes on camp, she talks about how some of the elements of camp are irony, humor, parody, theatricality, excess, extravagance, and exaggeration. There's often a little bit of vulgarity. There's often a little bit of hyperbole and exaggeration. I really like these two little cups. They're from the Royal Worcester Company, and they're called double gendered teapot, which I think it's amazing. Anyway, they're from the Met. So it's about kind of an aesthetic that goes beyond camp. It's not about depicting the natural world, but it's a stylization of it. It's kind of more than aesthetic. It's also decorative arts, fine arts, makeup, anything. So what does this have to do with Victorians, and what does this have to do with Dalnavert? So camp has been around for centuries, but it's one of those things that's really difficult to name. It has its origins in the queer community, or what was considered low culture. So the queer community, and more specifically the Black queer community, really perform camp better than anybody else because they don't have the privilege of fitting into the mainstream. When the mainstream is not meant for you, it is easier to live outside of it and exaggerate and make fun of it. And that's kind of really what camp is about. In the mid-19th century, camp started to be associated specifically with the queer community. Victorians had a close association with camp, and part of this was because this is when the queer community started to emerge from the subculture, but also because of Oscar Wilde. A lot of people associate camp with Oscar Wilde. And while he didn't invent it, he did certainly popularize it in the mainstream. He was kind of known as being a camp person. And his popularity certainly kind of helped elevate it. And he famously said, one should either be a work of art or wear a work of art, which many people and fans of camp really embraced. So there's this a little camp interlude. And this really leads us into our next art movement, which is aestheticism. So aestheticism is the belief that one should be surrounded by beautiful art and objects. It is art for the sake of art. It is one should either be a work of art or wear a work of art or be living in a work of art, essentially. So the movement rose to popularity in the 1860s and lasted until about 1900. There was this emphasis on drama, emotional expression, and individualism, which really went against Victorian norms at the time. There in Victorian art and architecture and design, there was always this emphasis on morals and ethics. They believed that art should serve a moral role. However, with the rise of aestheticism, interior decoration art now was just art. It was just art for art's sake. So there was no morality tale. It was just there to look pretty. So artists and designers kind of avoided a clear story or message, and they just really wanted to play up the art of it. So this really began to dismantle conservative traditions in Victorian, Victorian design and aesthetics. Some of them had a really difficult time with this at first because people are always looking for this morality tale. But beauty and self-expression soon began to replace ethical conformity. And it kind of started to change this more self-expressionism, which led to modern art movements. So in a way, it was queering of Victorian notions of art. And also it's very camp in that it's meant to be exaggerated. It's meant to be a work of art that you can just look at. It's art for the sake of art. So it's not a surprise then that Oscar Wilde was a massive supporter of the aestheticism movement. He thought one's home should be as beautiful as possible. And this kind of beautiful home would provide a really inspirational environment for people. This kind of started what was like called the House Beautiful movement, which highlighted the importance of decoration and design. While particularly like the idea of stained glass windows in houses because it provided a more subdued light, therefore a more relaxed atmosphere, which is like exactly what you have in Dalnavert. You have that beautiful stained glass window at the top of the stairs, which I think, you know, provides a really nice atmosphere. This was also the time when Eastern inspiration started to really make a huge impact on the art in homes. In 1853, Japan opened more trade to the West. So then you suddenly had this kind of Japanese decorative influence. So there's a lot of white and blue ceramics, kind of more motifs of birds, flowers, peacock feathers. This kind of all became a really large part of the aestheticism movement. And it just really changed life for middle-class Victorians because suddenly there was this cult of beauty, which really talked about like these beautiful handcrafted objects that you should have in your home. And they ran with it. I mean, you see here, these are 2 display cases from our Dalnavert in Color exhibit. And I've chose the pink one just because pink's my favorite. And this is the multicolor one. And they're just very like beautiful objects that are like there to just make the home more beautiful. The multicolored case is very like Rococo inspired, and Rococo similarly was not about like seriousness. It was a bit more like kind of cheeky and you know, not as serious as previous art movements. So it's, of course, you'd kind of have this like in aestheticism, a Rococo revival, where you have these objects that are just beautiful for the sake of being beautiful. So aestheticism really was not just queer in that it had this clear camp connection, but also that it rejected these Victorian norms of morality, which then went into inspire modern art. So the next movement was one that came out of aestheticism, which is Art Nouveau. And I think Art Nouveau is also extremely camp. So it began in the 1890s, and it would have been like really kind of trendy at the time that Dalnavert was built. In Notes in Camp, Sontag also notes that Art Nouveau is very camp in that it converts one thing into something else. So like a light fixture is suddenly like a flower, you know, and it's kind of what would be considered art camp about Art Nouveau is that it incorporates transformation. So a figure is actually a lamp or a flower or a banister. Like it's kind of like it's making an object not just an object but an aesthetic, and that was very Art Nouveau. So you have like the metro stations in Paris, which are very Art Nouveau because it's like not just a metro station entrance, it's a garden. And this was very like kind of in keeping with the movement. So in other words, you just take a boring everyday object and you make it in art. And this is kind of a way of looking at things. Not only like was it an aesthetic, but it was a way to look at an object. It's kind of about style and it's fashion over function. So they weren't really necessarily interested in making a functional object, but more of like a fashionable kind of piece in a home or on a building. You had a lot of like vines and snakes and flowers, insects and items like from nature, and then kind of in a more like a different context. And certainly everything was exaggerated, lots of exaggerated lines. And that was very kind of creating this like clear artifice, but also inspired by nature. So from this is a very beautiful Art Nouveau vase that is in the parlor. And we also have these lights. The one, sorry, the kind of like the lighting's a little questionable. The one is from outside of the dining room and the other one is from the dining room. So this follows kind of Sontag's version of Art Nouveau camp because it's converting one thing into something else. So in this case, it's a flower into a light, and it's an exaggerated flower. It has a function, yes, but it's also like very beautiful to look at. And similarly in the dining room, you have this, it's inspired by a peacock feather, but it's also a lamp. And so there's kind of this motif from nature, but making it into something else. It also applies to the wallpaper as well. You can kind of see it. Again, the picture was like the lighting wasn't working for me, but you can see this really beautiful green wallpaper, which has this like exaggerated floral motif on it. But perhaps probably the most clear example of Art Nouveau in Dalnavert is this lamp. It's at the banister at the bottom of the staircase. You can see the Ganymede neoclassical statue in the background. This is a functional object. It's a lamp, but it's also converted into a sculpture. So you have this fairy like figure, and she's holding these flowers, and she's standing amongst some like flora, but they're actually, the flowers are actually lamp shades. So Sontag states that camp plus everything, like puts everything into quotations. So this isn't just a lamp, but it's a lamp. This is a work of art that's playing the role of a lamp. And so there's a theatricality, there's a playfulness to this lamp. And this is kind of the perfect example of Art Nouveau and this kind of quotation mark version of camp. So now we're going to take a little break from art movements and talk a little bit about more background. And I'm going to specifically talk about queer Victorian women. I mean, this could have been a whole lecture in itself, so I just tried to condense it down a lot. So queer women were also establishing spaces in the 19th century. However, women often were not seen in the same light as men. They still aren't. And they certainly didn't face the same legal scrutiny that men did when it came to same-sex relationships. Often queerness in women was ignored throughout histories. Obviously, queer women have always existed, but it's just not something that people talked about. It was thought, people often thought that either queer women did not exist, it was something to be laughed at, or it was just something that you never should speak of. There's lots of recorded same-sex relationships between men in ancient Greek and Rome, but these relationships between women also existed back then. Also, not to speak that there's also like tons of like non-binary and gender fluid genders throughout history, but that's also another lecture. Other than Sappho, who is depicted in this image here, there's very little speak of and evidence of queer women. There was an ancient Roman funerary monument that celebrates a lesbian couple. It's kind of been like graffitied a few times to try and make one of the two women look more masculine. But I mean, like obviously these relationships still existed, despite the fact that someone's actively trying to eliminate it from history. So Queen Victoria didn't even want to hear about queer women. So when these laws were being written, like these anti-homosexuality laws were being written in the UK, women were excluded because Queen Victoria did not want to hear it. She just had no interest. She didn't believe that this actually could possibly exist. So in the Victorian era, this kind of started this like great erasure of queer women, but the queer community was becoming more visible. So kind of, you know, it was this interesting moment for a lot of queer people in general. Queer women who were wealthy, usually like white, wealthy queer women, did have the freedom to live their lives as queer people, as out queer people. There's several examples that we could talk about of queer women who were able to be relatively out and live openly with their partners. But this again was this was a luxury and a privilege that very few people had. And in many cases, their sexuality continues to be censored or erased. So we're just going to talk a little bit about Rosa Bonheur. There were some very strict dress codes in place. And in the 19th century was actually when men stopped wearing a lot of color. This is when men stopped wearing pink, which is a real shame because pink is the best color. It was easier for wealthy women to break some of these gender roles. Rosa Bonheur was a very successful artist. She painted in a realist style. She primarily painted horses and animals. This is her image here, the horse fair. She also often wore men's clothes, and she was openly lesbian. She openly lived with her partner. However, whenever you see an image of her, she's always wearing a dress because she felt that she needed to conform to dress codes when she was photographed or painted. So she was starting to break the mold in that she wore menswear more, I guess, in her private life, but she still openly was kind of conforming to these roles. But she still broke a lot of barriers in that she dressed how she wanted, and that she also was a successful artist in the 19th century when women were still not given the space and the time that men were in the art scene. So you see that class clearly plays a role, example with Rosa Bonheur, but also with other artists like Gluck. Radcliffe Hall was an author who wore menswear and lived openly. There's a lot of these people who, kind of lived, donned masculine dress and kind of were a little bit like, gender fluid in a way. But it's hard to call them gender fluid because you also don't know how they would have identified. So as the 19th century came to a close, women were starting to play more with clothing. Romaine Brooks is another example of an artist who lived with her 2 same-sex partners, and she also had a successful painting career. She played with gender roles herself. She painted people who were very masculine. You have this painting here, Peter, a young English girl. This is also the artist Gluck, who's kind of very androgynous, and her self-portrait where she's kind of wearing more menswear. And so this was a common theme in her paintings. She also painted women as extremely heroic, which was something that wasn't as common in paintings at the time. This really hadn't been seen since the Baroque era. We had Artemisia Gentileschi, who also often did this. So again, as the turn of the century came on, women began to slowly change, and fashions became less conservative, and suits and outfits to ride bikes in became more fashionable. Skirts got shorter, sleeves got shorter, the silhouette started to change, and then eventually they just did away with the corset. And the film industry had a massive influence on fashion and makeup. So the way that people did their makeup, the way they made it so it looked good on screen also became good off screen. And the silhouettes became more of kind of a boyish figure rather than like an hourglass. Women also began to work in factories, and they would fill roles that were traditionally filled by men. This was brought upon by the war. So women also started to have shorter hair. They wore pants, other menswear, they smoked cigarettes. And this type of fashion and attitude became more accepted, especially after the war. So they weren't like necessarily kind of adapting, like becoming more queer, but they were kind of adapting a queer aesthetic. And this kind of new trend for menswear and this fashion inspiration for menswear kind of made it difficult for some queer women to identify each other. But they still had their queer spaces, and due to the rise of queer clubs, they were in places like Berlin and Paris, they were still able to identify each other, and the community was, thriving. So if we're going to talk about, kind of, the rise of technology and the more, loosening of these kind of rigid gender roles and, rigid roles altogether, we're going to talk a little bit about Art Deco. So this is a federal building in Winnipeg. It's another example of Art Deco architecture. Lady MacDonald moved out of Dalnavert in 1929. And it was in the 1920s that Art Deco became a really popular movement and gained a lot of traction. It was a very decorative movement, as the name suggests. It was intended to decorate rooms and buildings in this kind of luxurious and modern aesthetic. There was a lot of bold and clear lines. There was a lot of geometry and symmetry, lots of gold, silver, and black colors. And it was kind of this representation of embracing technologies and moving into a modern era. And it had a massive influence in architecture and decorative arts. I'm sure all of us know a lot of examples of Art Deco architecture. If you go to New York, there's a ton of it. But there was also a lot of Art Deco objects in homes. So in Dalnavert, we have these, which are Art Deco inspired. You can kind of, I think, especially with the base, you can see there's a sewing machine in the sewing room that is kind of like, this kind of Egyptian inspired, which also has a lot of Art Deco elements. There's also like a fan that has these kind of, a lot of geometry involved. So how is Art Deco related to queer? Well, one of the best known Art Deco artists is Tamara de Lempinka. She was known for her very fashionable paintings. Many were highly sexualized, androgynous, and sleek, also quite camp. She also was just like a camp person. The men that she painted were often androgynous and feminized, and the women she painted were very sensual and rather desirable. Her nudes often had very homoerotic elements, especially this one. This is Andromeda. And this is her self-portrait here on with her sitting in the really, interesting colored green car. And so she has this very like luxurious energy with these kind of lines, which is very like Art Deco. Luxury, power, and sensuality is very like much her paintings. She was very popular, and Madonna is an avid collector of her paintings. So I guess kind of somewhat icon to the queer community, so you can connect it that way. But look, Dylan herself was bisexual. She was born in Poland, and she eventually married and moved to Paris, where she was given more opportunities as a woman. But it was also this time that she started having an affair with women, and then she moved to Italy. And that's when kind of she had this like really like circle of bisexual friends, and they all kind of like were this like super queer bisexual group of people, which sounds amazing. So like for me, Art Deco kind of really is just like more starting to be more free, more interesting shapes, and just kind of, again, the rejection of some of this kind of Victorian stuff. So just as we're closing here, I wanted to, highlight this quote from Eve Sedgwick's Epistemologies of the Closet. Here she's talking about the reaction from institutions when they are asked about queer histories and why they're erased. She says, "Don't ask, you shouldn't know. It didn't happen, it doesn't make a difference. It didn't mean anything. It doesn't have interpretive consequences. Stop asking just here, stop asking just now. We know in advance the kind of difference it could be made by invocation of these differences. It makes no difference, it doesn't mean." So obviously queer histories mean, they have a lot of meaning, and it has a lot of meaning when you exclude them, and it has a lot of interpretive consequences to the community when they're excluded. It is important to see oneself represented, but it's also important to acknowledge that the community has existed and that queer people have made contributions to histories. Often you see in institutions the same singular linear progression of moments in history recreated. This does not reflect the lived experiences of people, and it doesn't reflect the lived experiences of the queer community, especially when you're telling history kind of in this linear perspective. Also, when you're talking about queer history in the kind of history of law, like in this year they got this, and this year they got this. This doesn't reflect how people live. In 1969, when queer folks, when it was the partial decriminalization of gay sex, queer folks still were targeted by police. After same-sex marriage became legal in 2005, queer folks still face discrimination and hostility. After transgender people have gained more recognition, we still face discrimination every day, especially from those who are patting themselves on the back because they think they've given us more rights. I'm definitely not speaking from personal experience. The queer histories in Canada are very complex, and it is not, you cannot express it in a linear, singular history of dates and facts. Multiplicity of voices are the only way that you could have these more colorful histories expressed. History is often passed down from generation to generation, and when you do this from a singular perspective, you're not going to get the whole picture. You're going to get a fragmented picture. So as queer historians, it's our jobs to kind of look back at the communities and try and fill in these gaps and try and bring in a multiplicity of voices into these spaces. We're not just going to easily get kind of this representative euphoria, but we still have to keep on working with it, and we have to start these conversations. Adam Ely stated, "We are all born into a world that already has a set of rules. As queer people, we are required to break or bend these rules in order to be our authentic selves." So I feel like a big part that we need to play is bending these rules and making these narratives more authentic. We need to kind of throw out the traditional stories that are being told not throw them out completely, but also include more voices. We need to work harder to bring in these stories. So that's it for me. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Kyle. That was amazing. I love hearing all of that stuff from, especially about Dalnavert and Winnipeg. And history is so interesting. And we want to open it up for some discussion. So I put the, I guess, the format in the chat box. So questions can be typed in the chat box, and we can all look at them, or you can direct message myself or Kyle and ask a question privately like that to be answered, or feel free to raise your hand and just ask in person. You can unmute yourself if you like. I have to go back into the museum now and look at some of those things, objects a little bit differently.
Go in with your gaydar.
Yeah, that's right.
Your museological gaydar.
Do you have anyone with any comments or questions? It's a lot to kind of.
Actually, yes, I have a question. May not be big, but when you talk about queer, I mean, that's a term, that's a very old-fashioned term. I thought gay was the word to be used in these days. Like, like it may not mean much, but it's just a little confusing to me to use queer versus gay or gay. Are they interchangeable, or what does that mean exactly?
No, it's a really good question. So queer is kind of a more umbrella term. Like, it covers a lot more. And yes, it used to be a slur, but it's something that has been kind of like reclaimed by the community. So there's some people who would say, like, identify as gay, and they would use gay almost as an umbrella term as well. I personally like to use queer because I think there's kind of a bit of a political edge to it. And it's also a bit more fluid. Like, there is kind of this like fluidity to the word, because it kind of can mean different things, but basically it just means like kind of going against the kind of heteronormative grain to me. But yeah, thanks for it's a good question. So thanks for asking.
You're welcome.
Vanessa said that she has a comment, maybe a question. Vanessa, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yeah, Kyle, I hope you guys can hear me. Thank you so much for this amazing talk. I'm seeing Dalnavert anew, someone who cares a lot about it. And I really appreciate how you managed to pull on like art, decor, architecture. I didn't see the architecture coming, clothing so much. But I've been thinking about how Dalnavert kind of comes with an almost like a ready-made metaphor, pretty heavy-handed one around the closet. I'm thinking about the closet in the main bedroom and how it kind of looks open to visitors, but you can't actually use it as a passage to kind of get anywhere. It's kind of fascinating in that way. But just with that in mind, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about like the investment that 19th century homes like Dalnavert made in privacy and like in divisions around privacy. So the kind of invention of the closet as a storage space is interesting in of itself for the 19th century, but there's other kinds of divisions in the house between, say, like the sexually active main bedroom and then the kind of sequestered children's bedrooms and then the servants and stuff. I just wondered if you kind of indulge me by talking about privacy and the middle class Victorian home.
Yeah, first of all, I love your kind of little thing about the closet. It's really interesting to think about that way. Yeah, it's interesting to think about space just in general, like kind of how private space, public space, or in the house, kind of the different usages of space. It's not really something I've given a lot of thought to, but it is very interesting to think about like how, especially with Dalnavert, how like, there's certain rooms that like your visitor would never go into. And like you would never really show your true self in certain spaces, even in your own home. And I feel like that also is kind of, going into your closet metaphor. It kind of works again with it's very queer in that sense, where you can't really show yourself unless you're in certain spaces. And I think that it's really interesting. Like that's like a whole, again, that's a whole other lecture. Like you and I can write a whole like paper or lecture on that, and it'd be really interesting. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. That's great.
I would love to hear more about that, and maybe we'll have to have you back for more lectures and more talks, and maybe even a tour of the museum would be.
All the closets.
All the closets.
Just go do all the closets.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good idea. We're coming up with programming as we. Anything else? Anybody want to jump on the closet tour plan, or more discussion about the lecture? Feel free to unmute yourself.
I'll shamelessly jump back in, Charlene, and just say, Kyle, I had no knowledge of kind of the queer geography of Winnipeg. Could you say a little bit more about the hill behind the legislature? Like, I don't even think of there being a hill. Is that like the slope down to the river? Is it like a riverbank, or was there some kind of geographical feature that's no longer there?
I'm not 100% sure. Yeah, when I found that out too, I was just like, or just so close, like the ledge, but at the same time, it's not that surprising because I don't know, this is the whole like tie-in with the Golden Boy, and like the last slide I had there with that image with like the light and the loafers, which is just that poster is just, it's on Broadway. It's just like around the corner from Dalnavert. So I was walking to work one day and saw that and went, oh, this is perfect. But yeah, it's really interesting to think about it in that sense, because you don't really hear about these spaces in Winnipeg. You hear about it like in Toronto or London, and then you're like, no, Winnipeg had these histories too. There was a lot of like kind of Chinese owned restaurants that also were very like important spaces for the queer community, because it was kind of this, queer people could keep their mouth shut. So it was fine, and they were there because they're being discreet and they're being quiet. So it's kind of like, yeah, and as someone says in the comments, Prairie Fairies, A History of Queer Communities and the People of Western Canada. It's a really good resource on that. So thank you, LDJ. It's a really interesting book, and it does kind of highlight some of these spaces in Winnipeg as well, if you wanted to know more about it.
Great, that was a really cool book. Yeah, Kyle, I don't know if you want to talk just a little bit about your like background and your like your educational background.
Sure.
Your master's program and stuff.
Yeah, well, I have a master's and bachelor's degree from the University of Manitoba in geography. So I'm really interested in people and spaces. And then I have a PhD in museum studies, or as Charlene said before, I focused on queer art histories. So I'm very interested in how queer people are talked about and included in spaces, or not talked about and not included in spaces. Because a big problem is that it's very it's checklisty often. So it'll be like, you'll have your Pride event and you'll have all these queer stories, and then as soon as Pride is over, those stories go out the window and you never hear of these things again. So these galleries will pat themselves in the back, or these spaces will pat themselves in the back and go, we're so good, we're so in touch with the queer community, and then they'll never have it again. Or all the labels will be like, they'll use words like they were friends or they were neighbors. That was the one thing that really got me. As I said, I studied in Leicester, but I lived in London, and there was an exhibition about Robert Rauschenberg, and he was gay and his partner was Jasper Johns. So they worked together and they also lived together. And the label in the gallery says, this was done with Jasper Johns, his neighbor. And I was like, no, that was his partner. Like that was his, like, and I was just like, and this is so common to use words and language like that to try and avoid talking about queer histories. And so they kind of just, yeah, it's very, it's a conditional welcome. As long as it's kind of this time like Pride, you will be welcomed in. But as soon as that's over, you're gone, you're out the window. So that's kind of one thing I find that with a lot of these museums and queer histories is that it's not fully celebrated, it's not fully embraced, it's very superficially embraced. And they often will talk the talk, but they can't walk the walk.
Thank you for that. I have a question here from someone in the chat to me. So I think you sort of talked about it a little bit, but I'll just ask it. There's a tendency to think of Victorians as very conformist and restrained, but you've shown many examples of breaking away from those patterns. Was this mostly a prerogative of privilege, especially economic? And did other classes in society, in Manitoba or elsewhere, have any such opportunity for gender or sexual self-expression during these eras?
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that often histories focus on upper middle class and like, upper class people. So we don't really get like some of these other histories. I think in a way, sometimes they would get more freedom, but also not. A lot of histories of like queer histories are recorded in like police records. So often these people were like, if you go into like a police archive, that is sometimes where you get the best queer histories because that's where they're recorded. And it's really sad actually. Or it's either that or sensational news headlines. So really it's kind of, I guess people who were not kind of, I guess, in the spotlight as much still face these consequences. And often it was kind of a bit rougher in a way. They didn't get dragged the same way like Oscar Wilde did, or there's artist Simeon Simon. He kind of was another one who his career came to an end once it came out he was gay. So I guess it's probably easier to conceal yourself if you are kind of someone who it'd be more fluid, but at the same time, you weren't given a complete freedom just because you weren't in the spotlight or you weren't kind of out in society as much.
Thanks for that. And so, do we know anything about? Do we know anything about Hugh MacDonald's role in policing queer identities, like literally because he was a police magistrate?
Yeah, I don't know. That's actually an interesting question. I guess if we went and looked through some of like the kind of police records, maybe you'd find something. I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, but yeah, because it's probably there. I'm sure if you look through the police records.
Yeah, that'd be interesting to look through this project.
Mm-hmm.
Get a hold of them.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thanks for that question and answer. Anyone else have anything to add? Otherwise, we'll probably wrap up. Oh, everything. Thank you, Kyle. Great. So, if there's nothing else, then I just want to thank Kyle so much for doing this lecture. It was so interesting, and I just have I want to hear more and more and more. So really piqued interest here, and I think it's really there is an interest and a really important discussion to be had. So thank you all for attending this lecture. I just want to say that there are more coming up. There's another one in a month. If you go to our website, the next one is with Vivi Devi, and she is a local playwright. She did a lot of research when she was focusing on a PhD with Victorian pet culture and rabies as a metaphor for masculinity in Victorian times. So that's coming up in April. And then we have a talk on Annie Valentine, the incredible Mystic woman, and what made her famous. So if you are interested, that's happening in May. So please go to the website to find out. Please donate to the Elizabeth Alloway Fund with the Winnipeg Foundation. And thank you so much, Kyle. And so I'll see you again. Enjoy the rest of your day.